Welcome to Truth and Liberty. Thank you for joining our daily live call-in broadcast where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to the issues, and you can call in and get your questions answered in real time. According to the Bible, it's the truth you know that sets you free. So call in today to get answers, information, and resources to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and the world. And now here's your host, Richard Harris.
Hello everybody, I'm Richard Harris, your host today for the Truth and Liberty Show, and it's so great to be with you. I've been out for a little bit of time off and just really excited to be back. I hope that you watched and enjoyed the programs that we had for you, during my absence. And we have a fantastic program lined up for you today. I believe you're going to really chalk this one up as one of the most informative programs that you've seen. Today on Truth and Liberty, we're going to be talking about manhood and masculinity and what it is, what it's about, why it's important, and why the devil is attacking it in our culture so vehemently. And I'm going to introduce our special guest here in just a minute, but wanted to remind all of our audience today that next week is the annual Truth and Liberty Conference. So our conference starts on Thursday night, and it'll go Thursday evening, all day Friday and night, and then Saturday until 5 or 4:30ish. And we have an incredible lineup of speakers and events. It's going to be on the campus of Harris Bible College here in Woodland Park, Colorado. Dr. Ben Carson is going to be with us. He will be the featured speaker, and then also Rick Green, the founder of Patriot Academy and Biblical Citizenship in Modern America. Also Pastor Che On, the lead pastor and founder of Harvest Rock International in Pasadena, California, who's a true patriot, Korean-born American who knows what it means not to be free and loves this country, stood up to Governor Newsom's regime during COVID successfully, and won a victory at the United States Supreme Court that blessed all of us. And but many other speakers, including Torben Sondergaard. Oh, I failed to mention my good friend Bill Federer will also be speaking. Andrew will be ministering as well as myself, and also Luke Ball. And Luke is a young up-and-coming Christian conservative who is often featured on the program Flashpoint and a good friend of our ministry. I can't wait to hear Luke. It's going to be great. We'll have over 50 different exhibitors, conservative Christian organizations in our exhibit hall where you can connect and learn more about how you can get involved and make a difference. I promise you this year's conference is going to be the best yet, and you won't want to miss it. So go on our website and register. It's a free event. If you want a meal, you'll have to pay for that, but otherwise there's no charge. So come, be encouraged, be informed, and get equipped to stand for truth in the public square. Hey, listen, also I wanted to mention that we have our first ever film. Truth and Liberty has actually produced a documentary film. The title of it is Hope for the Future. And this film is going to be available beginning next week. It's in the final phases now. They're going to start copying it to USB drives now. And you can get a copy of Hope for the Future by becoming a Truth and Liberty member. So go on our website. You can sign up to make a recurring automatic contribution of $5 or more per month, and we'll send you a free copy in the mail. Or you can purchase it for $30 on our website. And it tells the story of 3 prophetic words that Andrew Womack has ministered over since 2021 that talk about what God is doing, and that the third great awakening has actually begun. We are blessed to be a part of it. That this woke stuff that you see going on all over the place is actually going to be coming down in the near future, and the people that are in positions of influence are not going to be there. Now, I know that might seem like too much to believe, but it's already happening. You won't catch all that on MSNBC, CNN, or the other mainstream networks, but if you tune into what's happening with God's people, you hear about it. Revival is taking place all over the world, and there is a lot of good that's going on. So get a copy of Hope for the Future today. All right, let me introduce to you then our very special guest for today's program. Nancy Pearcey is a professor and an author. She's an apologist, and I believe a professor of sociology. I may be wrong on that, and she can correct me. But she currently teaches at Houston Christian University and has spoken at many notable other notable universities, including Princeton, Stanford, USC, Dartmouth. She's written a number of books, including the one that I really want to kind of dive into today, and that's The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And so, Dr. Pearcey, I am so thankful to have you on the program today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And by the way, I teach apologetics.
Apologetics, okay.
Yes, yes.
That's awesome. That's like a dream job.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It totally is. I get to make the case for God every day in every classroom. I can't think of a better job.
Oh, that's so fantastic. Do you know our good friend Alex McFarland?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Alex serves on our board here at Truth and Liberty, sometimes hosts the show and stuff. He's also an apologist and an educator, and yeah, fantastic. Well, Nancy, I'd like before we dive into this incredibly important subject today, I'd love it if our viewers could get to know you just a little bit. So you're an apologist, but you have somewhat of a unique background. You were raised in, I think, what people would have called a Christian home, and yet you faced some issues in your childhood which caused you to maybe reject the faith, but you ultimately came back to the Lord. Can you share your story with us real briefly?
Yes, I did tell the story at the front of this book because I felt like it was important for people to know that that I came to a biblical view of masculinity through very difficult circumstances. It wasn't easy. I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was physically abusive. He wouldn't say, do this or I'll spank you. He'd say, do this or I'll beat you. And then he would. His favorite was the knuckle fist. You know, he would be punching us like this with one finger extended for a sharper stab of pain. So not surprisingly, when I got to high school, I started just asking questions. You know, I'm raised as a Lutheran. My parents were Scandinavian. I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran in the way that all Irish are Catholic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's kind of an ethnic religion. And I think one of the weaknesses of ethnic religions is people, you know, they rely on the ethnicity as opposed to having a really firm personal commitment. So that when I started asking questions, my parents had no answers at all. I just started saying, how do we know Christianity is true? That's it. I'm attending a secular, you know, high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I asked my parents, you know, I asked my dad point blank one day, why are you a Christian? He's a university professor. But all he gave me was, works for me. I said, that's it.
Wow.
And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, also Lutheran. And all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I guess Christianity just doesn't have any answers. And it seemed to me a matter of intellectual honesty, that if you don't have good reasons for something, you shouldn't say you believe it, whether it's Christianity or anything else. And since obviously I wasn't getting any good answers, about halfway through high school, I was about 16, I very intentionally walked away from my Christian upbringing and decided, I guess it's up to me to figure out what's true. And so that's how I started looking at philosophies and so on, because I realized very quickly, if there's no God, then there is no foundation for ethics. You know, it's just true for me, true for you. There's no meaning to life. You know, we're just on a rock flying through empty space. There's not even a foundation for knowledge. Here's how I thought about it. If all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and history, what makes me think that I could have access to some sort of transcendent universal truth? Ridiculous. You know, it seemed obvious to me that.
All right. Well, we've lost. Okay, we're back now. Go ahead.
Yeah,
we had a little
bit of.
Just a little interruption in the feed, but you were saying that it was obvious to you that how could you have access to transcendental truth with your puny human brain if that's all there was?
Right. So at age 16, I had become a moral relativist. I had become a skeptic. I had even become a determinist because of my science classes. I was taught that we evolved from mindless, purposeless forces, and we are just biochemical machines with no free will. So I had absorbed all of these secular isms by the time I graduated from high school. And so you could see I was really ripe for the kind of apologetics method that Francis Schaeffer did. I happened to, well, I went back to Europe. We lived in Europe when I was a child. And so that's how I happened across the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And as you probably know, what I tell my students is the two top apologists of the 20th century were C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer, in terms of the sheer number of people who converted through their work or were brought through a crisis of faith. And so, you know, I lucked out. My husband put it this way: we lucked out because we ended up going to Francis Schaeffer's ministry, and that's where I ended up becoming a Christian, because it was the first time I ever encountered Christians who could answer these secular ideas that I had absorbed by that time. And so I was very impressed. I had no idea there was such a thing as apologetics, you know, that there were good reasons and arguments and evidence that to support Christianity.
Wow,
And
that's
so that's
fantastic.
why ever since then, everything I write, everything I teach, all has to do with helping young people understand that there are good reasons supporting Christianity.
Well, I've got some of your books listed here, but where can people go to find out, you know, to discover more of your works? We're going to talk about Toxic Masculinity book, but do you have a website or somewhere like that people can check that out?
Yeah, nancypearcey.com. And I have to tell you, my publisher just revamped it for me, so it's fun and colorful. Yeah, you can browse my other books. You can see what else I've written. And like I say, they all have something to do with defending a Christian perspective. Like even the book we're talking about today, why did I write it? To defend a biblical view of masculinity over against a secular culture that's attacking it. So even though it's, you know, most books on you know, Christian manhood are kind of devotional books, mine is an apologetics book. It's saying, you know, masculinity is being attacked in our culture today. How do we defend it?
Well, and so let's talk about that. Hey, masculinity is being attacked in our culture. What do you mean by that? I mean, I guess in the last few years, we all heard the phrase toxic masculinity. It seemed to sort of leap onto the stage, you know, suddenly. The phrase did, but I think the concept is not new, because the identity of men and their role in society in the West has been under attack for, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 years. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, my attention was caught by very very polemical headlines. I still remember when I read in the Washington Post a headline, "Why can't we hate men?" And I thought, really? In a mainstream publication? The Huffington Post, an editor tweeted hashtag "kill all men," and then said it was a joke. And speaking of jokes, you can buy t-shirts that say "so many men, so little ammunition." And there are books with very blunt titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" So the attack has been pretty blatant. And what's really tragic, I think, is that some men have also joined in attacking their own sex. There's a male author who wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then you may have seen this because it was in the news. It was several months ago now, but the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was in the news saying testosterone is a toxin and you have to work it out of your system. So this is what the kind of headlines that were catching my eye when I decided to write this book. I wanted to explain, you know, where is this coming from? You can't really stand against a trend unless you know where it's coming from and how it developed over time.
Well, where is it coming from? What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, most people do think it came maybe from the 1960s, second wave feminism. But the surprising thing that I found is it actually goes much further back. You have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because before that, men worked alongside their wives and families all day, right? On the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role, you know, on the responsibility for their family. There's even secular historians say that the ideal for masculinity was, in their words, duty to God and man, you know, duty and service. And so the question is, how did we lose that? Well, the answer is the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home into factories and offices.
All right, we've lost Nancy for just a few seconds here. I'm hopeful that she will be back. We're talking about her book, Toxic Masculinity, or the Toxic War on Masculinity, and how Christianity reconciles the sexes. It's already a fascinating discussion, as Nancy was saying, that we were talking about the Industrial Revolution and how it took men out of the home and the farm into factories and offices.
Yeah, we're having some connectivity problems here, but
Yep.
yeah, for the first time in American history, men were not working alongside people they loved and had a moral bond with, their wives and children. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that was a very different work environment. And immediately in the literature of the day, you start to see people protesting that men were losing the caretaking ethos of the colonial era, and that they were becoming egocentric, self-centered, self-interested, greedy, acquisitive, and turning their work into an idol. I was surprised when I was reading the literature of the day how many times people said, you're turning work into an idol. Instead of work being a way of supporting your family, you're turning work into something to promote yourself, to promote your professional ambitions. And so that's when you first start seeing negative characterizations of the male character. And I think, well, that kind of suggests how we have to change it. We have to change it by seeing if we can reconnect men better to their families, to their children. And so I spend quite a bit of time in the book explaining some practical ways we can do that too.
Well, so Nancy, the word masculinity itself conjures up images, right? And it conjures up sort of stereotypical views. But really, what is masculinity when we use that phrase? How would you define it?
Well, I'm going to tell you how men define it based on sociological studies. This is how you got the idea that I was a sociologist, because I quote so many sociologists in this book. I wanted to see what, in fact, men, I didn't want to impose on them my definition, but what, in fact, do men already know? They're made in God's image. And I'll give you two studies that were really eye-opening. One was an anthropologist who did the first global study, international study on concepts of masculinity. And he found that despite cultural differences, there is a core definition of manhood that is shared by all cultures. And he boils it down to what he calls the 3 Ps, that a good man will provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father or mentor the next generation. And I thought this is fascinating, because what it means is that men themselves know, they're made in God's image, and they know that their unique masculine strengths, because men are stronger than women, their unique strengths were not given them to get whatever they want, but to provide, to protect, to love, to care for those that they love. And this is an intrinsic, universal knowledge that all men have. These were not Christian cultures. This was global. And what it means is that we have a much better way of approaching these issues. And most men do not respond well to being called toxic, right? Nobody would.
No.
And so what we can do is ask, is there a way to tap into that universal, innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man that all men have just because they're made in God's image? And so that gives us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Yeah. Well, and in today's world, outside of, really outside of the gospel, the message that men receive about what it means to be a man, it takes those same themes, but it perverts them, right? So protecting becomes, oh, you're a man if you're tough and you can fight and beat up other people and all this, cage fighting kind of stuff. Providing, well, you got to have a lot of money or, fancy cars and stuff. Like procreating becomes all about sex and that sort of thing. But you're saying that actually probably there's truth inside of those 3 things, but there's a biblical role for men. And how do we restore, your book talks about how do we restore that biblical understanding of masculinity. Am I understanding it right?
Yes. Well, let me give you 2 answers. One is I'll give you another sociological study, and then we should head over to the biblical side of things. But there's another study done by a sociologist. Again, it was global. The sociologist gets invited to speak all around the world, and so he came up with this very clever questionnaire where he would ask young men themselves, what does it mean to be a good man? He has two questions. The first one was, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? All around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologists would say, we're doing that. They'd say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. And that's why I come back to the image of God. Most men globally know what it means to be a good man. But then he would follow up with a second question. The sociologist would say, what does it mean if I say, man up, be a real man? And then the young man would say, no, that's completely different. And that gets into what you just said about even good traits get perverted. Because the men would say, oh, a real man, that means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so the sociologists concluded that men are actually trapped, torn between these two competing scripts. On the one hand, there is, again, this innate universal knowledge of what it means to be a good man. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. But there's also a cultural script of the quote unquote real man. And they're not all bad traits. I mean, we want people to hang tough in a crisis. But if it gets separated from a moral ideal of the good man, then of course it can slide into misogyny, entitlement, control, and so on. The Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast women. I got an email from a former graduate student just a little while ago, and she said, I'm teaching high school now, and all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in their yearbook. And I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. Wow. So that was disturbing. And it really pressed home how important it is for us to have a biblical view of masculinity. And these young boys they don't have a critical grid. They're just absorbing the secular concept of masculinity because they don't have an alternative. It just presses on us the importance that we really come up with a biblical, healthy, positive view of masculinity.
Well, and so how do we do that, Nancy? How do we restore that biblical understanding? It seems that the duty to do so falls on Christians and on the church. So where do we go from here with this?
Well, once again, I consulted the scientific literature, the social sciences. See, there has been the idea in the media narrative, right, is that Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? That they're the worst. That if you hold to any notion of male headship or authority in the home, that will turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarch. Well, that's an empirical claim. And so the sociologists and the psychologists were saying, well, where's your evidence? Where's your data? You're making these accusations. But have you done the studies? So they went out and did the studies. So on one hand, it's good that evangelical men were targeted because then the social scientists went out and did the studies. And what they found is that Christian men who are theologically conservative, who attend church regularly, test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. They do test the wives separately. By the way, that's important. I always get asked, yeah, otherwise, if the wife is just sitting there with her husband, she's not going to be honest. So that's a valid concern. And what they're reporting is that the wives are reporting the highest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular fathers. Evangelical couples divorce at the lowest rate, 35% lower than secular couples. And then the real surprise is evangelical men have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America, contrary to the negative media stereotypes. Sometimes a quote can capsulize it. So let me give you one quote on this. The sociologist who did the largest study was from UVA.
Okay, so we're again have a little glitch here. Nancy was explaining that sociological studies are proving that evangelical men can be proven to be actually, she said they have the lowest divorce rate of any group. They spend 3.5 hours more time with their children than secular men, and the lowest rate of domestic abuse, and their wives report high levels of satisfaction in their marriage. I'm sure there's more that she was going to share with us when our internet feed was interrupted there, but wow, those are powerful numbers, aren't they? And hopefully Nancy will be able to rejoin us here momentarily. But we're talking about masculinity and what it means. So when we come up to the break...
support and affirm and encourage men.
Okay, Nancy, you're back, and we got you mid-sentence there. The last we heard from you, you had said that that sociological studies show that evangelical men commit the lowest rate of domestic abuse, I think, of any group. And so maybe you could pick up there again. I apologize for the interruption. I don't know where that glitch is coming from, whether it's yours or ours, but...
I know. I have not had a problem with Zoom for quite a while, so I don't know where this is coming from either. Did it cut off before I gave you that wonderful quote? Sometimes the quote.
Yes, it did. It did cut off just before you were going to share that.
Okay. So yeah, I think a quote really drives it home. So the person who did the largest study was Brad Wilcox. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he publishes in places like the New York Times. So this is a New York Times article, direct quote. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Theologically conservative women who attend church, who hold conservative gender values, that's how he puts it, who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands, have high quality marriage, probably 73%. And so this is the data we need to bring into our churches. Mm-hmm. This is not in the churches yet. You know, I had to go digging in the academic journals to find it. And so I think the first step is bring this data into the churches and give churches the means to encourage and support and affirm the Christian men who are in fact doing very well in spite of the negative stereotypes that they keep encountering. I had a graduate student who was the head of the women's ministry at a very large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
Yes, that's true.
And so I thought, okay, no more scolding. You know, bring this positive data into the churches. It's wonderfully encouraging. I quote about a dozen different studies in my book. So this is solid empirical research. This is not a pep talk from a religious leader. You know, it's rigorous empirical data. So we should be very confident about bringing it both into the churches, well, and also into the public square, to show that the scriptural definition of the family and of manhood does in fact have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in the subtitle of my book.
Well, I don't think that I've really ever heard an informed, articulate message from the pulpit on gender and gender roles and that sort of thing in the church. Nancy, do you think that pastors and ministers out there in the church are really equipped to address this subject?
Well, if they read my book, it's really only 2 chapters out of the book, by the way.
Okay.
And so it's not, it's the 2 chapters that encapsulate all of this sociological data on Christian men.
Wow.
And so a lot of the rest of the book is on.
Oh, we lost her again. I'd like before we go to a break, let's put up the lower third about where people can get a copy of this book. Again, it's called The Toxic War on Masculinity, and it's by Nancy Pearcey, who is a professor at Houston Christian University. And so I encourage all of you, all of our viewers, to get on that website, get a copy of this, read it, highlight it, share it with your pastor, share it with others who are, maybe people that are involved in this radical assault on masculinity and gender ideology stuff. And we're going to take a break now, and we'll be back here on the Truth and Liberty Show in about 90 seconds. Please don't go away, because we have a lot of content left for you.
I want to give you a special invitation to join me for our Truth and Liberty Conference on September the 12th through the 14th. I tell you, these conferences are some of the very best meetings I have ever attended in my life, and this year we've got Dr. Ben Carson with us, Pastor Che Ahn, Bill Federer, Marjorie Dannenfelter, who's head of the pro-life organization in the United States, Rick Green, Luke Ball, Richard Harris, and myself. It's going to be a great, great time here at our facility in Woodland Park. We're going to have workshops in the afternoon and just a lot of different ways to help equip you so that you can be salt and light in this society that we live in. Join us for our Truth and Liberty Conference, September 12th through the 14th in Woodland Park, Colorado.
With Practical Government, you have experts in the field that are sharing their perspective, wisdom, and experience. It's not available anywhere else in the world.
We're going to teach a Christian heritage of our American government. They're going to learn about the Founding Fathers. We're teaching the Constitution, how government operates, practical skills, and field study.
No matter where you're coming from, the world needs you.
Whatever God's calling you to do, you're able to do it.
To learn more, visit practicalgovernmentschool.com.
Okay, we're back here on the Truth and Liberty Show. I'm Richard Harris, and my guest today is Nancy Pearcey, a professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University, and an author and you know, just an expert in many different subjects. So Nancy, I'm so thankful to have you with us again after the break. I apologize to you and the audience for the glitches in the internet feed that's allowing us to have you as a remote guest. We're having some thunderstorms here, and I think that might be contributing to things. But we were talking before the break about whether pastors and churches are equipped to push back against this toxic masculinity narrative that's being forced on us from the culture. And I'm not sure if you had finished all of your comments on that, but is there anything more to say about that?
Yeah, yes, pastors have a twofold challenge. So on the one hand, how to get the positive data into the churches, right? Because it's not there yet. And that's what we covered before the break. But it's also true that nominal Christians test out shockingly different, and we need to learn how to deal with that as well. So nominals are people who might check the Baptist box on a survey, but who attend church rarely, if at all. And their wives report the lowest level of happiness. These nominal men spend the least amount of time with their children. They actually have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular couples. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So the sociologist that I quoted earlier from University of Virginia wrote an article in Christianity Today, and he said the most violent husbands in America are nominal Protestant evangelicals. So that's what we're up against. How can we, on the one hand, encourage and affirm the men who are doing well, who are regular churchgoers, who are authentic in their faith, and who even, you know, the studies are showing that they are the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And on the other hand, how can we develop a discipleship program that will really reach out to these nominals who are, in a sense, ruining the reputation of evangelicals? Because they're hanging around the fringes of the Christian church enough to pick up language like headship and submission, but they're imbuing those words with meaning from the secular culture. Like you said earlier, the secular culture tends to twist and distort these words and give them a different meaning. And so that's what's happening with these nominal men. And so that's the challenge to the church. It's really twofold, right? How to on the one hand get up to date on the positive data, and then how to reach out to the nominal Christian men who are, you know, following the Andrew Tate the pattern of the Andrew Tate phenomenon.
Well, you know how I interpret what you've just said is that those men and families that have a real living relationship with Jesus Christ and true faith in His Word, that transformative power of Christ in them makes them into the men they were designed to be and helps them to live out God's image in them. That's just sort of my articulation of it from a spiritual perspective. Is that sort of what you're saying? Well, it's funny. Nancy keeps dropping off at like these, pivotal moments.
I'm sorry, did we glitch again?
Yeah, just when you were starting to answer, you froze. So
I'm agreeing with you totally. I think it's incredibly encouraging that what we're hearing is not just, from the pulpit on Sunday, but that these are rigorous scientists, sociologists and psychologists going into the study and finding the same thing. They're finding that men who actually live out their faith in an authentic way, who are really accepting God's design for their life as husbands and fathers, have better marriages, better families, happier and healthier. I mean, we shouldn't, on the one hand, we shouldn't be surprised, right? If God designed us, then if we live according to his design, we're going to be happier. But it's nice to see that, sociologists, and these aren't all Christian sociologists, by the way. I ran into some who are not even Christian. And they're also agreeing that Christian men who live out the biblical design end up with better marriages and happier families.
Wow, that's such a testament to the truth of God's word. But Nancy, as a man, and I would say this on a personal level, but also just as an observer of culture, and in the work we do here at Truth and Liberty, I believe that men for a long time now in our culture and in the West have been inundated with negative messaging about their manhood. And you mentioned it earlier that the woman at the large church there in Houston said we give the women flowers and we scold the men on Mother's Day and scold the men on Father's Day. Boys from a young age in our education system are taught that they need to, sit up, be quiet, be still, do their work quietly, all these things that run smack into the testosterone that's coursing through their blood and makes it difficult for them. And then they're shamed when they don't comply or can't comply. Men are told, you need to talk about your feelings and you need to communicate on these things and have face-to-face time. And the basic overall message is you need to be more like a woman, more like a girl, because being like a man is bad. And I'm wondering, that might be a little bit jaded on my part, but am I onto something here?
Oh, very much so. I ran into it in my research. I carefully avoided all the books and articles that basically said, the solution for men is to be more like a woman. I threw those out. There are quite a few of them. I quote a psychotherapist who publishes frequently in the Wall Street Journal. And she said, especially young men, she sees are being beaten down by these negative messages, that manhood, that masculinity is bad. And here's how she puts it: the young men coming into my practice are increasingly downbeaten and depressed because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. A 2020 survey found that almost half of American men agreed with the statement that these days American culture seems to punish men just for acting like men. And in 2024, this was even more recent, this was an international survey. 60% of men said that women's liberation has gone so far that now, discrimination is more common against men. And whether you agree or not, that's a lot of people who think that men are now getting a bad deal. And we're seeing the consequences, too, that men and boys are falling behind in culture. This constant reign of negativity does, in fact, destroy their confidence, so that all the way down to kindergarten, boys are falling behind. They don't have the same fine motor control that a girl has, and so they can't use the scissors as well. And so already in kindergarten,
all right, so folks, we continue to offer you our apologies for the interruption, but here all right, Nancy's back now. You were talking about not the boys and girls differences. Boys don't have the same fine motor skills, generally speaking, and then you were making another point. What was that?
Right. So they feel like they're falling behind already in kindergarten, and they are in fact falling behind in terms of both test scores and grades, falling behind girls, all the way through high school. In college, I don't know if you know this, I was surprised to learn that today 60% of college students are female. Only 40% are male. More women than men go to graduate school and even professional school like law and medicine. So women are just charging ahead. in education while men are falling behind. And once they're out of school, men are falling behind. Men are much more likely than women to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, homeless, mental illness, of course, crime. 90% of prison inmates are male. And unemployment. It's no longer showing up in the unemployment statistics because they're not looking for work. But researchers dug deeper and they tell us that male unemployment is currently at Great Depression era levels.
Oh, wow.
That was a shock. Because
Yes,
we all
I
remember
heard
what
that.
a crisis the Great Depression was. We are at Great Depression era levels of male unemployment. And then life expectancy has also gone down. Women's has not. So it's not a general trend. Men's life expectancy has gone down so that a magazine called The New Scientist looked at this data and said, the major demographic factor in early death now is being male.
Wow.
So I think it's time for us to say, shouldn't we have some compassion on men? You know, shouldn't we start having special programs for men, for boys in school, for the boys' unique learning style, for example? You know, shouldn't we start thinking through some ways to help boys and men? We have lots and lots of programs for women, and that's great. See, the thing is, we set up programs for girls in school, like the 1994 Gender Equity Act, so 1972 Title IX. And people thought, oh, we'll bring girls up to where boys are. They had no idea that girls would shoot right past them. So nobody expected this, but that's where we are now, that girls are far outpacing boys all through education. And of course, it shows up then when they're adults. So how about some programs for boys starting in kindergarten? It's been hard to make that case. Because to be frank, feminists have opposed it. They've treated it like a zero-sum game. If you help boys, you know, you're not going to help girls anymore. No, we can do both.
Yes,
and
a finite pie, and you can't can't have more or I'll have less. Yeah. So Nancy, on that point, I remember when my wife and I were, you know, our firstborn son was going into kindergarten, right, and that sort of stuff. Now he was a strong-willed child, as Dr. Dobson would call it, and was rough and tumble kid, boy, all through and through, you know. And so he had a little bit of trouble there with, you know, kind of pushing or maybe occasionally hitting another kid or whatever, and not sitting still and these kinds of things. And I started to look into it, and I was reading material that was saying that our education system has been tailored around girls, and that boys are suffering now because of it. So some of that I see from firsthand experience. We were real fortunate to have a Christian school with a teacher and a principal that was sympathetic to that issue, and they were able to give a lot of grace for our son, but it was great. But can we really resolve this whole question as a society, as a culture, if we don't talk about differences between men and women, and that is it's a biological fact, but it's also traceable to our creation, and there's a purpose for these differences?
You're reading my mind. That's where I was going to go next as well. And let me bring it from a slightly unusual angle. Let me tell you about a feminist who went conservative, because it's kind of fun to see somebody from a very liberal secular perspective come to see the biblical view. So her name is Louise Perry, and she wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she was well known as a very liberal, left-leaning author. She's British. And then she worked for a rape shelter. And the turning point came when she said, we have got to acknowledge the differences between men and women. Because just physically, men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have more fast twitch muscles, which means they can react more quickly. And she was coming at it from the perspective of, for women's sake, we need to acknowledge these differences, because up until now, it's been largely kind of a feminist thing. We can't acknowledge differences because if we do, whatever differences there are, women will be defined as less than. So the solution is to deny differences.
Yes.
And so here was a very liberal, leftist, feminist person saying, oh man, we have to acknowledge differences for women's sake, because a woman needs to realize.
All right, so Nancy was saying that we have
who's much bigger and stronger than you.
Okay.
And that was the beginning of her turning point. She has now become if you read her book, she's now come very conservative on sexual ethics. You should wait until you get married to have sex, which is, she gets on these secular radio podcasts and they say, "What? Are you
Oh,
really
blasphemy.
saying that?"
Yeah, yeah.
And she said, you don't want to have sex with a guy until you're pretty sure he's going to stick around to take care of any kids who show up. And the best guarantee is that ring. That's
Yeah,
how she
the covenant.
puts it. That ring
Absolutely.
on that finger is a pretty good guarantee he'll stick around if a baby shows up.
Well, isn't there something? Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the marriage. So today, our culture says, well, you don't have to be married to have sex. In fact, marriage is old-fashioned, and you can divorce whenever you want. It doesn't really matter if you're not in love anymore. And all of this kind of stuff. The cheapening of the marriage commitment, of the marriage covenant, the degradation of traditional Christian family, and so on. But doesn't the marriage commitment, doesn't data show that it actually has sort of I don't know what the word is to use, but it focuses the man's natural energies towards good rather than sort of a wildness and more of a destructive nature, right? So like the welfare state, for example, has removed the incentive for marriage among certain segments of society, and we see those segments also with the highest imprisonment rates and violence rates among men, drug addiction, and all this other stuff. Am I also onto some? Am I right, basically, on that?
Yes. Of course, you're right on almost everything, but but yes. The word you were looking for was marriage has a civilizing effect. That's how sociologists put it. Marriage has a civilizing effect on men. Right. It gives them a purpose, a meaning. It directs their energies to supporting and protecting their wife and children. And without wife and children, many men, young, unmarried, single men are the ones who are the most violent in every culture. And places like China are having to deal with this because the one-child policy now, they have far too many young single men who can't find wives. And what happens then? They roving gangs of single guys. One of the worst things that can happen, or they join the army. That's how you build up a military. But yes, marriage and women too, though. Actually, women. I had a friend of mine who's a Christian woman, and she says, "My children made a mother out of me," which is kind of a clever way of saying, I wasn't responsible. I was selfish. I was self-centered. I was, flighty, and then I had kids. Kids focuses you, gives you a sense of responsibility for another person's life, this very helpless person. You're right, that's another part, going back to Louise Perry, just to show you the transformation of a secular liberal person. By the way, I have heard from friends she is attending church now, so even the secular part she's starting to question.
That's great.
So from a very secular liberal perspective, in her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, she waxes on the importance of marriage and just what you said, that marriage has a good effect on both men and women. And I thought one of the most important things was the differences between men and women, because just start with the biology. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. Because of testosterone, they do tend to be more aggressive and risk-taking. And I think as Christians, we should at least start there. Those are creational givens, and they're good. These are pre-fall, right? This is how God made men. And so we should be very diligent to make sure that we are affirming and supporting God's design, that the masculine character, is something that God created, and it's good. And it's good for women and children too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned the sexual revolution and liberal feminism and all this. I think we were inadvertently talking over each other there. Another internet glitch. Go ahead, if you don't mind.
I was just going to say, because feminists have been they've been concerned about acknowledging differences, because in many cultures, women's differences are seen as less than. So it is important for us to also encourage women to see their uniquely feminine traits as positives, and not as negatives. Because, the secular world says, don't have kids. It takes away from your autonomy. It takes away from you being able to have fun as an independent woman. We should be the ones who are saying, no, the uniquely feminine qualities that God gave women, That bearing children is their superpower, and that
Amen.
caring for young women takes incredible depth of character. This helpless baby, when it's in distress, you respond immediately, right? You don't scold it, you don't reason with it. You have to respond immediately, no matter what you're doing. So you have to be very sensitive. You have to be very selfless. You have to be willing to be interrupted at a moment's notice. Stop doing whatever you're doing. You have to be very aware of nonverbal communication, because they don't talk yet. And you have to be aware of threats in the environment that might hurt your child. So women become mama bears.
Yep.
So we have to make sure that we're treating masculinity as a good. Like I love the word you kept using, design. God's good design. And to counter feminism, we have to really make sure that we're also equally saying that women's unique traits are also good, and that both men and women will be happier and more fulfilled when they live according to God's design.
Absolutely, and I think that's just tremendous. If we look at in Scripture, Nancy, in Genesis chapter 1, it says that God said, "Let us make man in our own image." And then it says, I believe it's in verse 26, he says that he made them in his image and in his likeness. But yet we don't see, in the biblical account, it tells us that God separated woman from man, pulled a rib out of Adam, and from it made the woman. But that separation didn't happen until after the declaration by God that man was made in his image. And that was when the two sexes were joined together. So there's an equality there, it seems to me, right? That man and male and female are equally in the image of God. But the separation implies that and the obvious to our eyes and senses, there's differences. The differences imply distinction in role and function. And so it seems like on the left that they have a hard time accepting that there could be equality with difference, and so they're denying that there are any differences. We can't have that because that means we're not equal. But that's a fallacy, isn't it?
It's hard. I think it's a human thing. It's hard for people to hold both of those truths together, right? That there's equality in terms of status, in terms of being made in God's image. And those differences that need to be valued and cultivated and encouraged as well. I think it's just a human problem that we have a hard time holding those two things in tension. But I think as Christians, we need to do that. And I think that if we look at cultures throughout history, Christianity has done a better job than any other culture. So we should be, instead of tearing down Christianity, we should be building it up and saying that wherever Christianity is gone, there has been more equality, all the way back to the early church. In my book, I go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And one of the reasons that the early church had most people don't know this, but the early church had a lot of women. A large percentage of the congregations were women. Why? Because women had so much more dignity and so much higher status than they did in the surrounding Greco-Roman culture. Women had a very low status. We can tell that partly from the fact that abortion and infanticide were practiced primarily against baby girls. Baby girls were not valued. It was very unusual for a Roman family to have more than one daughter. They'd have one token daughter, but then the rest would be, killed at birth. And of course, abortion was practiced. It was very unsanitary. So a lot of women lost their lives through abortion as well. And so when women, and of course women, couldn't go outside. In Jewish culture, you couldn't go outside. You couldn't talk to a man. Jesus talked to women. He was violating the culture, the Jewish culture of its day. I have a whole section on how Jesus violated the cultural trends of his day. And he elevated women in ways that nobody else had at his time. By talking to them, by touching them. When he healed women, like Peter's mother-in-law, it says he touched her. He taught them. In Jewish culture, women were not supposed to learn the Torah. That would contaminate the Torah. Yeah. But Jesus taught women. Mary being the most
obvious, right? So Jesus taught women, she was saying, and how Christianity has elevated the status of women. And so, yeah, excellent point. Hopefully,
it kind of reverses things. So all that to say, Christianity has historically always raised the status of women and of marriage. I mean, there was some celibacy during the Middle Ages.
All right.
In marriage, but especially at the Reformation, the Reformers said, no, that's Greek. That's not biblical. We have to bring back a high view of marriage and family, and that's why Luther, left the monastery and married a former nun, and he didn't have to preach it. He did it with his life. He said marriage is valuable before God, and and has a high status. It doesn't have the low status that the medieval church gave it.
My wife and I we're getting down to the end of the show here, so we don't have a lot of time. But the other day, my wife and I were talking about the lies that have been sold to women, and specifically, we were referring to abortion and the lies that are implicit in the whole abortion message. But I was trying to make the point that there's a whole string of lies that women have been sold in this in the last century or century and a half even. And I think one of the ones that is at the root of it is the lie of divorce, that divorce is somehow liberating and that marriage is a bondage to women. But the truth is that, like we were saying, marriage civilizes men, but doesn't it also protect women for the most part, especially in a truly Christian home, not a nominal Christian home, right? But generally speaking, what are your thoughts about that, and how does that tie into this whole issue?
Oh, completely. I mean, why did God make men bigger and stronger? So he could protect his wife and children.
Yeah.
I mean, once you see this, you can't unsee it. It's like, let me get back up. Okay, because I had an abusive father, which I mentioned in the first part. I had an abusive father, so not surprisingly, as a young adult, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism. And I read all the feminist books. I read the foundational ones from Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir. And I read them all, and I thought they were wonderful. And then when I became a Christian, I had to sort of rethink it all. So when you say the lies that women have imbibed, I was there. I totally did. For years and years, I always had some feminist book on my bedside table. And so it took me a long time. Again, this book came out of my own struggles, my own personal struggles. It took me a long time to start seeing masculinity as a good thing and to realize that the differences between men, like you say, are designed to protect women, are designed to give women the security and the stability because they are smaller and physically weaker. And they are focused on raising children. I mean, that's what female means. I mean, biologically, female is the one who has children. Mm-hmm. And so that when children are young, when a woman is pregnant, nursing, and taking care of young children, it's almost impossible for her to work also and support herself. Those are 2 full-time jobs. And so that's why God gave you 2 parents, so that one could be, raising children and, like I said, pregnancy, nursing, carrying children in a sling on your back is very time consuming. And before the modern age, it took most of women's adult life. They were usually bearing children through their whole adult life. And so you needed somebody else who would do the providing and protecting. I mean, this is such a perfect design once you see it. And writing this book helped me even to clarify, my lingering feminist, years. Working through this book helped me to come to much greater appreciation of why God made the 2 sexes different. And because I have to tell you, for people who might a group in America, I do have 2 chapters on abuse in the book. Because otherwise it would look like I was sweeping that under the carpet, right? I had to deal with that.
Yeah.
And so in those 2 chapters, I also deal with a lot of biblical answers to when there is abuse. When a man is not following the biblical pattern, what is our response? And in a nutshell, I'll tell you the response. It's what Jesus said. Jesus said, if somebody's sinning, Matthew 18, you go and confront them. You point out his sin to them. And if they don't listen to you, you bring a few witnesses. And if they don't listen to them, you bring it to the church.
Yeah.
And if they don't listen to the church, it might be time for some kind of church discipline. So Jesus gave us the response. Unfortunately, you have to say that, though, because for a long time, Christian books did not. For the longest time, Christian books have blamed the wife. If you would just love more, if you would just forgive more, if you would just make his favorite meals, if you would have sex more, if you would, please him and placate him and be more submissive, then he would blossom into the man you want him to be. I'm actually quoting a pastor there. A pastor was telling an abused woman, he said, he will blossom into the man you want him to be. Well, we know that's not human nature.
Right.
If a person is willing to hurt somebody else to get what they want, that's a bully. And you know that bullies do not respond well to being, if you try to placate them and please them and appease them. We know that from the playground bully. We know it from the international scene, a belligerent nation.
Absolutely.
So fortunately, the good news is books by Christian therapists and pastors have begun to change. They're now moving into saying what Jesus said, which is no, as a person who's being abused, even a wife, has a right to say, this is wrong, to stand up and apply Matthew 18. So that's the good news. I found all the best books on the subject. So if you are if anyone listening is in a position where there's abuse in the home, I do have 2 chapters on it where I pulled out the best resources that I could find.
Absolutely. Well, Nancy, this has been the most fascinating discussion, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity to get to know you a little bit and talk about this important subject. And I want to encourage our viewers now, as we are pretty much out of time on today's show. We're actually 1.5 minutes over, but I'm going on because I want to finish this. To get a copy of her book, it's once again, it's called The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, and you can get it on her website at nancypearcey.com. I also want to take just a minute to mention that I've written a booklet on manhood myself. It's called A Calling to Manhood. And in this book, we talk about the scriptural calling, the idea that God has a calling on men as men that is unique and different than women. And that it's my view that men are called, I don't have the 3 Ps, but what I say is men are called to fight, men are called to work, and men are called to lead. And it doesn't mean that women don't work and women don't ever have to fight and women don't ever have to lead, but the predominant calling is on the male, on the man. And that we, in this day and in this time, in our generation, that men need to rise up and take this calling on, accept it, and not be ashamed of it, but stand up and fulfill God's purposes for us in this generation, because our generation is in desperate need of these things right now, especially for righteous fighting, leadership, and work. So you can pick up a copy of The Calling to Manhood on our website at truthandliberty.net. Nancy, I once again want to thank you. I hope we have the opportunity to meet in person sometime, and also to have you back on the show, and we can continue discussing this at a later time.
Thank you, and I look very much forward to reading your book on the subject.
All right. Thank you again. And everybody, thanks for watching the Truth and Liberty Show. We'll be back on Friday with another special edition you won't want to miss. So watch again on Friday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time, truthandliberty.net.
Thank you for joining today's Truth and Liberty livecast. You can watch today's and past livecasts in our archives at truthandliberty.net. Our goal is to educate Christians and connect them with resources and organizations to help them impact their sphere of influence. You can help us accomplish this by making a donation at truthandliberty.net/donate. Join us next time for more Truth and Liberty.